Hello, everyone. Today, I'm going to talk about the culture shocks of Chinese sojourners in America, which is a reflection on the article, How We Know What We Know About Americans. So basically, I will introduce the contents of the article and the background, and also a summary. And I will introduce the intercultural communication models involved and my reflections on the article and some relevant materials. So firstly, let me introduce the content of the article. After Chinese sojourners arrived in America, they constantly experienced cultural shocks, and the author interviewed Chinese students at 2 universities and tried to figure out the sense-making process of these sojourners on American culture. According to the author, the sense-making process is an accumulation and also a circle. So here is the background. With China's reform and opening policy in 1980s, the number of Chinese sojourners, mostly students or scholars, has been increasing steadily. The interviews were conducted in 1990, shortly after the June 4th massacre. That's the first time American government allowed Chinese students to apply for permanent residency after graduation, which means a lot of sojourners finally became residents. Most of the sojourners were outstanding students funded by the Chinese government for their study in the US. Now here is the summary of the article. We can see that the author broke down the sense-making process in intercultural communication into 4 steps. The first one is assumption. We assume everything works the same in the US. And then, surprise, we found out it's different. And the third step is making sense. We try to convince ourselves that it is American culture. And now we came to an understanding that we understand how American culture works. We can see that the 4 students here, what they encountered are all small incidents like accommodation, trolleys at airport, a talk on marijuana, and collecting clothes on a rainy day. However, these small incidents revealed the huge difference between the culture of China and America. Now let's talk about the intercultural communication models involved in this article. The first one is cultural iceberg theory, which illustrates the intangible and tangible cultural difference. We can see that most of the time, people just focus on the surface culture, which are fashion, music, language, literature. These are all tangible. However, we always ignore the deep culture, which might be facial expression, gesture, friendship, and even about cleanliness. And the second theory is the 6 dimensions of culture. We can see that all the differences are based on these 6 dimensions, which are power distance, individualism, uncertainty avoidance, masculinity, long-term orientation, and indulgence. And finally, by exposing ourselves to a different culture, we can develop intercultural mindset. And here is my reflection on the article. I think the author's statement may be outdated and overstated. The article was written like 30 years ago, and as the advancement of communication technology and more visitors here in the US, I believe the cultural difference is not that huge anymore. And another fact is that cultural differences do exist, but I believe that in many cases, the differences between individuals are greater than the differences between groups. China is a country with 1.4 billion of population, and America is a country with 50 different states. We each have huge cultural differences inside our country. And of course, this leads to the third point that we should respect people with a different cultural background. And here are some related materials of this article. The first one is a journal article which is called Sojourners or Settlers, Post-1965 Chinese Immigrant. So this article reveals the demographics of Chinese immigrants in the US in the recent 50 years, and also talks about how the Chinese immigrants are being distorted, their image being distorted, their voice being ignored. This is something we as Chinese people experiencing every day in the US. And my perspective on this article is that many times we think what we encountered is cultural difference, but many times what we encountered are actually discrimination. And also, the second video is about life for Chinese students and scientists in the US amid tensions with China. It is a documentary by CNA. It talks about a rise of racism and tension against Chinese students during the Trump administration. What I want to talk about this documentary is that besides cultural shock, there are some important issues for us to deal with. And these issues, compared with cultural shocks, are even more important. And that's the reason many studies find out that the recognition of American value has been decreasing constantly among Chinese sojourners. And finally, here are two questions for the class. The first one is, as a local American student, what kind of stereotype do you have on Chinese students and scholars? And the second question is about, if you are a sojourner in China, which is opposite, what kind of culture shock do you expect based on your past experience and knowledge? Here is the reference of my presentation. Thank you very much for listening. Bye.